Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on this super sunny Thursday. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 763rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the immense pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation and reading featuring John Yau and Tyhe Cooper. Before we get started, the Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's amazing guest and host. John Yau has been publishing reviews and essays on art and literature since 1978. He is the publisher of Black Square Editions and co-founded the online magazine Hyperallergic Weekend. Recent books by Yau include Joe Brainard, The Art of the Personal, published by Rizzoli Electa in 2022. He is the 2017 recipient of the Jackson Prize in Poetry and a 2021 recipient of the Rabkin Prize for Art Criticism. He teaches at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University and lives in New York. Tyhe Cooper is a writer working in experimental prose, poetry, and digitality. They are the production editor and a poetry events coordinator here at the Brooklyn Rail. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you both here to the NSE today, and I'll pass it over to you, Tyhe.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And thank you to Chloe and Carolyn and the events team at the Rail. And thank you so much, of course, to John for joining me today and for making the book that we're here to talk about. I am so out of word thrilled to be able to talk about Joe with you, John, and with all of you here today. I am constantly talking about Joe Brainard, and I think that I was saying this just now before we went live. I think my friends are glad that I've got somewhere to put it now, so I'm just yakking at them about Joe. But I'm really glad to be talking today with you, John, and I think specifically about Joe. I've learned so much about community and collaboration and beauty and the real and all of those things from Joe Brainard's work. And I've made so many friends through his work. So I'm just really honored to get to talk today about him. And also a happy birthday to Joe Brainard. He would have turned 81 on Saturday the 11th. Yeah, he was born in 1942, like all my favorite people, my grandmother included. Yeah, so we can actually pull up the slides if that's good with you, Eleanor. Yeah, so John, I want to start by just kind of asking you to talk a little bit about how this book came to be. It's really the first of its kind. It's a really gorgeous monograph with a really beautiful essay by you detailing so many of the important aspects of Joe's work. And I want to just have you talk a little bit about how it came to be. And, you know, you've been writing about Joe for a while, but how this specific book came into being.
Well, there was the exhibition at T-Bourdenage of 100 works by Joe Brainard, and there was a reading that night, I think the night of the opening. And so I was there and looking around at all this work, thinking I have not seen most of this work before. I've seen some of it, but a lot of it I had not seen. And I think at one point I was really staring at and wishing I could buy it, his collage with Anna Mae Wong. And I think next to was Carol Lombard, two actresses that I'm a big fan of. And I was standing next to Ron Padgett and I said, you know, someone should do a really big book on Joe. And Ron said, yeah, or something like that. He was pretty, you know, he didn't act totally excited, but he didn't act dismiss me or anything. And then I went home and forgot about it. And then 4 days later or 5 days later, Ron called me up and said, So do you really think Joe should have a big book, and would you like to do it? And that was it. I was like, yes. And then I have an editor at that I've worked with for various projects at Rizzoli that I really like, and I called her up, or I emailed. I've never called her. I emailed her, and she said yes, that sounds great. And then she and Ron met, and the book happened. And the whole thing was, I mean, I said to Ron, and initially we have to put a lot of work in that nobody has ever seen before. And then Ron really helped find a lot of the images because he seemed to know where almost everything was. And I certainly didn't, because there was one moment when you start to do a book, you think, how am I going to find all this stuff that I know exists? Right. And he did. Other people did. Andy Arnaud at the gallery, and different people. It was great, and I got to see all this work that I didn't know about, so that was great.
Yeah, I also, on the note of like collecting the work and finding it all, your acknowledgements page at the beginning is so, I really loved it. And it's really, I mean, with Joe specifically, as I was saying before, that community is such a special part of
Right.
the work and the life, and was also a really big part of you creating this book. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, that gathering process and how you interacted with that community through it.
I think I posted something on Facebook because I know Steve Levine had a piece and contacted me and sent me an image of it. I wrote to various people I know. I talked to different people. Who do you know? Blah, blah, blah. Who has work? And then Ron would give me lists of people, and I would write to them, or he would write to them. And practically everybody responded with something. And then I met Tony Toll, who was his roommate. I mean, I know Tony, but we had dinner a couple of times, and he told me stories about Joe. So it's a lot of just gathering. Annabelle Lee helped me get in touch with Duncan Hanna, who wrote me stuff. It was just really gathering. Chris Felver, who took this photo, I asked him, what was it like to take Joe's photo? And he's like, oh, I have many more pictures, so we had to only pick one. So it was pretty amazing. All these people are really enthusiastic. And then it reminded me, of course, as I'm doing this, of when I first came to New York, was I think 74, hearing about the show of 1,500 works, and going to it. And of course, I didn't know that I could probably have even afforded one. I was just like, I wonder how. I never asked how much anything cost. I just assumed it was more than I could afford. But it was one of those shows that just you don't forget. You just go, how did this man do that? Like little matchbooks, this, that, and the other thing is like whatever came within his hand's reach, he turned into art. That's how I felt about him. Nothing got wasted. And then that great photo in his house, in his studio on Green Street, just full of paper. And then you see this tiny bed at the back, just like he's like a monk living with his art stuff, right? It's kind of amazing.
I was just talking about that photo of Joe yesterday. I was actually comparing that photo to your incredible book setup behind you. And I was talking about it like that was like the most famous photo in the world. I was like, that photo of Joe in his studio.
Oh, so I had this one anecdote about Joe. So I didn't know Joe at the time. And a friend of mine, Ellen Davies, a poet, was getting a drawing by Joe for his magazine for the cover. And he's at my apartment. And he goes down to get the drawing. He gets the drawings. I literally live 4 blocks away from Joe. Comes back to my apartment, looks through the drawing, and realizes he lost it in the 4-block block. Okay. And he's freaking out. And I say, oh, just call him up. I don't know why I say this. I said, but you have to tell him that you lost the drawing. And so he calls him, like after about 5 minutes of us saying, and Joe says, oh, that's okay. Why don't you come back and get another one? I mean, that's who he was. To me, that was like, I didn't know him at that point, but he said it's something like, these things happen. I mean, really? They do. Anyway, he went, I was like, let's go back and lose another one and get a bunch of drawings from Joe. That thought did pass through my head, but I didn't tell Alan that.
Yeah, with everything about him, I mean, I figure you just keep whipping him out for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Describe the drawing for you. You do another one.
Yeah.
Eleanor, can we go to the next slide? Thank you so much. So this show at Tabor, the opening for the show was also the launch for your book. And it was a beautiful show. It was the first time I had gotten actually to see Joe's work in person, which was so exciting. I was very, I wasn't crying. I don't do that. I would never. But I was in there and I was so thrilled. And I wanted you to talk with you a little bit about, the works in the show versus the works in the book. We see here some of these works are in the book. Specifically, I want to talk about the toothbrush painting on the left there, which is so gorgeous.
That's a beautiful painting.
And we have if in the next slide, Eleanor, a close, yeah, there we go. And this is the spread that painting is in the book. I just wanted to have you talk a little bit more about, how that worked and the ways that the book can do things that the show can't. The show does things that the book can't, and just talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's he didn't think he could paint, which is because he never studied painting, and I think he just felt a little nervous about it. But you can see that he's a wonderful painter. I mean, this painting belongs to Anne Dunn. I knew her slightly in Rodrigo Moynihan, so I had seen the painting before, and it's one of those. It's so ordinary. It's just 3 toothbrushes, well, 4. In a thing, and it's just like somehow it's magical. And then a bunch of scallions. I mean, I don't know. I really love this painting. Some things you love, you can't explain it. You just love it. So that's one of those paintings I saw. I just like, and yeah, it's so ordinary and so great. I mean, ordinary in subject matter. But then again, like, how many paintings of toothbrushes have you seen? Maybe it's not so ordinary, right? Maybe it's kind of extraordinary, like what he notices, right? So that's, and it's just got this beautiful sense of color to it and light.
I think this one specifically, I mean, there's something really happening here, because
Oh yeah.
At the show, I mean, because I was really drawn to it, and I went and I was so thrilled by it. And then friends of mine, I had gone and withdrawn, and I was watching everyone watch the show or look at the show. And I feel like I was seeing everyone just kind of gravitate towards this specific painting. So there's something really happening there. And I think it also is a lot about, Joe's interest in the ordinary and the real, which we're going to talk more about in just a moment. But we have a little bit more of the installs of the show if we want to.
Sure. So if you go back to the one before, yeah, if that black image on the right hand side, that's the one that's a photo of various members of the Dada, and then he sticks in Nancy, and that's the one that came from Steve Levine, poet that I've known for a long time. And it was one of those things where things really come up out of the woodwork. Like, I don't think that work had ever been shown. I forget how Steve got it, but it's like, what do you think of this? I'm like, that's going in the book. I mean, the minute I saw it, I said, that's going in the book. And yeah, so there's a lot of that happened, because it was like, you see these different sides of Joe that, because a lot got known, but it's like, I think much smaller than he actually was in some way. And that was and small, it's still pretty big, all the different things he did. But then you find out he did even more.
I feel like as anyone delves into Joe, it's like this crazy spider web of connections. The very first time we met was on a Zoom call that was for some other event, and Nathan Kernan was there.
Right.
And you guys started talking, and then later I was reading the tribute to Joe in Pressed Wafer 2 that followed
Right.
the retrospective that Connie did. And there was, the piece from Nathan Kernan, which was it was his submission of Joe's answers for the Steve Abbott questionnaire. And I had
Right.
just been on this Zoom with you both, and I was like losing my mind, so excited. If Eleanor could go to slide, I think 6. Cool. Oh, actually, sorry.
Great photos of them.
I love those photos. We're going to get to them in just a second. I'm so excited. I just want to talk about this this self-portrait on the left here. I mean, these are both so beautiful, but this one on the left is it's one of my favorite works of Joe's, and it was in, the show as well as in the book. And I talked to you about this a little bit, but there's something about that parenthetical in this text on the left here: a clear sky, that's what's important nowadays in Boston. Everyone wrote,
Right.
but me, and then in parentheses, Joe. And I think something about that, and the way that he includes his own name and doesn't assume that you're going to know who he is, even though he's the creator of the self-portrait,
Right.
so significant to his work. And I was wondering if you could talk about the inclusion of this self-portrait and general thoughts on his self-portraits that are included here, because it's a hard to cull from.
And also, he never looks the same in his self-portraits, right? I mean, he has a kind of changeable identity. I mean, you always recognize him, but with these kind of interesting plastic clear frame glasses. Well, he goes to Boston, I mean, to come out really, and to kind of get away from Ted. And then he does this pretty formal portrait, but there he is reading Dostoevsky. He was going, he was an incredible reader. I mean, in the few letters we exchanged at one point, he wrote to me and said, "I'm going to read all of Dickens for the second time." And I was like, how many books did Dickens write? And I think I looked it up. It was something like 37. And I just was like, I think I had read 5, and the whole thing of him wearing a tie, he has a job. He finally first he's getting cigarettes out of the ashtray from the library. He's eating like 1.5 pieces of white bread a day or something. He's not really complaining. I mean, a lot of people would have made that a huge act. He just said, kind of tells Ron that's what's going on. Then he gets a job and he still walks to work. He doesn't use the money that he's got to take a subway. I mean, he was pretty, but he his art changes. He's really excited the whole time about what he's making and things like that. So, I mean, he's a complicated guy. He writes beautifully in a way that you don't instantly get how complicated he is. And he never felt, he never asked for pity. He never wanted you to pity him. I mean, that's, if I ate 1.5 pieces of white bread a day, believe me, a lot of people would be hearing about it. You know what I mean?
I think, and that what you're saying about how much he was reading, and that makes the output make so much more sense. If you're taking all of that in, you got to put it somewhere.
Right.
And with the Dadas and the Nancy's, he was really an enthusiast in
Right.
a huge way, which is,
that's a good thing. That's a good way to describe him. He's an enthusiast.
And it's so beautiful to see. And if we go to the next slide, Eleanor, these photos, I love these photos so much. We've talked about this. The one on the left is on across the street from his apartment on 6th Street, which is a dry cleaners now. It's like a storefront apartment where, again, he was living in squalor. It was a gross apartment. He was splitting it. They were taking shifts, being awake, right? That's crazy.
Right. Ted would sleep at night and he would sleep in the day. I think that's how it was.
It's so insane.
And they're sharing the same bed, but they took turns sleeping in it.
And this is the year that he wrote Self-portrait on Christmas Night. He was 19 in these photos, right? And Self-portrait on Christmas Night is really, you read it and you can see his whole life, and you can see him seeing his whole life panning out ahead of him. And he's 19, and it's this gorgeous text. And it's really, I saw it as something that you really use to guide your essay and the points you made in the essay. And his interest, he says, I want to be real and do real things.
Right.
So huge to his practice. So I guess I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you use that essay to guide, or how you use that piece to guide your essay.
Well, had read it, and then I read some things about it. They were saying how adolescent he was, and this and that. And then I read it again and thought, there's nothing really adolescent about this. He's figured out something about what he's making, and he's not a fantasy artist, And then you think about a lot of artists when they're young, they boys that draw tanks, or they have a kind of imaginary world. And really, I mean, Joe's imaginary world's always connected to the real world, as Nancy being an ashtray. I mean, very tangible. And then I think he was like that, as really deeply. And even when you read I Remember, you feel like, oh, how can he have remembered this so clearly? But you feel like a tactile, tangible sense of his understanding of the world. And that would explain also the toothbrushes, right? It's something we see every day. We might not stop and think about it as a thing that we would look at and want to actually paint or whatever, And I think that's really a side of him that became pretty clear in that essay. And I was kind of, amazed, because he is so young. Because when I was 19, I did not think that clearly. Like, I can just tell you that, but that's probably no surprise. So in that way, it was great to write about him, because I learned a lot about him as I was writing about him, and got to think about what he did. And because he also chooses, he works in collage. In a way, he's very different than a lot of the other members of the same New York school, Alice Katz, Larry Rivers, Jane Freilich, because they're doing oil painting. They're in the masterpiece tradition, and he doesn't do that. I mean, he does paint, but it's not what he's like identifying with. And then you think of people like Auden saying, doing an anthology of minor poets, or John Ashbery and Jimmy Schuyler loving John Clare. You just realize, like, there's another way to live in the world, and not thinking about this thing called the masterpiece tradition, right? There's as Ashbery was saying, the other tradition. And that seemed to me really important, to kind of think about that in terms of Joe's work, because he is a great artist and a great writer. So the whole notion of masterpiece becomes irrelevant, right?
Yeah, I think one point that I really loved in your essay, that I think you drove home really well, and that I was really appreciative of, was this choice that was involved in that, right? Because I mean, you illustrate this in your essay. He was a prodigy. I mean, he was 16. Right. He was doing these incredible paintings. He was supported by people in his town. He was winning these like contests.
Right.
And I think, and we can see it in Self-portrait on Christmas night. It's a conscious decision to move towards what I would brand as generosity and community and beauty and all of these things over some canonical version of success, right? He talks about it in that same piece, the choice to, if I have success, I won't want it anymore. Doesn't mean anything to me. And I really loved the way you structured your essay around that. Eleanor, if we could go to the next slide.
Oh, and that great image on the left, which I love. Ron showed me that. I was like, that has to go in the book right away. Who would have put a de Kooning next in this photo? I mean, this image, right?
It's so unhinged.
It's totally great. It's totally funny and like unsettling. And here's this guy, one guy's barefoot, these miners. Clearly the guy's gonna die. He's not an ailing miner, he's a dying miner. And there's the de Kooning, right? It's like, what does art have to do with life here, right? And he's not making it a big question, but you can't not help but think about it. And that he's already thought about it, and he's not upset about it. He's just going to say it, and then go on making art. And that's kind of wonderful. right? Because that thought, if you had that thought of what does art have to do with life, you know many people, you've read about many people who become really grim, really kind of insufferable, suffering people. He did not do that. And he could have easily, in our minds, but that wasn't him. It's like, I love making art. There's a joy to it. And there's a kind of wonderful humor in this piece,
Yeah, I think I feel like I've learned so much about joy from him and his work and his community. And but I also really loved, just on a technical level, I really loved the way you did a close read on this piece, and how you went into it, and also how you used it to contextualize Joe within the art historical canon, like, the way you're talking about his relation to Alex Katz. And you also, in your essay, talked about the way people have compared him to Warhol, and how
right.
he could be better compared with, Ray Johnson, Bruce Conner. And I thought that was a really key point, in that with the humor and the joy that is so present in his work, it can be kind of, people love him, but it can be, he gets kind of left out of the art historical canon a bit sometimes, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I want to hear you talk about that. Sorry.
Yeah, well, he didn't push himself really. I mean, he gave his art away. He was not focused on success. There's the whole art world, or at least, as seen through the New York Times, focuses on like, how much is this work sold for at auction, and blah, 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 and, kind of celebrity, or there's that, well, I don't know to you if it's well known, this, photo of Jeff Koons holding up his baby in New York Magazine, like the baby's a trophy, and it's a claim to being normal. Like, I'm really normal. See, I have a kid and I can hold the kid up like a trophy. Like, Joe's not interested in all that kind of silly behavior that, people reading the Times and want to believe in normalcy need, or they need to have some measure of success. Well, how much does this work sell for? Well, he sold his work at some point for $25. Does that mean he's not successful? What does success mean? The other thing about Joe that I think is interesting, and I didn't say this in the book, is I've had this thought recently, is you can't really get a handle on him, right? He's a writer, he's an artist, he's made all these different kinds of work. You can't say, oh, he's a collagist, because that's not all he is, or he's a this, but he's really much more extensive and less definable than people, I think, realize. And I think that's the next kind of thing. Actually, if I were to write about him again, I'd probably focus on that the kind of artist or writer that you can't get a handle on, is, I think, pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's illustrated in the book, in the sense that, you can't show the work without talking about that, right? If you're looking
Right.
at the work, you can feel it. And if we can go to the next
And he
slide.
was pretty humble. Like, he thought he couldn't draw. I mean, those drawings are stunning. I was like, no.
I know. And he talks about like having trouble with oil paints, and
Right.
like it's it's crazy. And I don't know, but could go on. I wanted to pull up specifically this spread because I really liked the way you put these two works together, because these colors are like, I mean, they're almost exactly the same, and they're from the same year / 1 year apart. And then of course the one on the right is the collaboration with Ted, which
Right.
his collaborations with everyone, but with Ted specifically, are some of my favorites. So I guess I want to use this as a segue to talk about how you decided. 1,500 works in a show, 1975, and that's like not even all of the work he made. So how
Right.
do you go about collecting the work of someone so prolific?
We tried to get, well, in the early work, we just tried, Ron and I talked about this, like really signal pieces that we felt like showed him doing something and getting somewhere. And so, first of all, he does the 7-Up, but he never turns it into like, a logo, right? Like the Campbell soup cans. Everyone around him is doing that. The other thing I think is he saw, as did everybody, but he saw the Dada show at MoMA and he took it to heart. Lots of people saw the Dada show and said, okay, that's the Dada show. I'm going to go make an oil painting, right? He took it to heart that you could make stuff out of anything, right? And it kind of fit in with his life at that point. He's, doesn't have a lot. And it fits in with his life. And he's not trying to like live another life and sacrifice his life to get that other life, whatever it is. I mean, him and Ron live in an apartment with no electricity, right? And they don't complain about it. It's like, okay, that's our life. Let's keep going. Let's figure out how to make stuff or write stuff or go to school. And I think that says something about him as an artist, because he's not thinking, I have to have certain materials in order to be an artist. Is I'm an artist who will use whatever materials I have, right? And I think if anything, that's probably the first time he saw the Dada artists is when he comes to New York. He's 18 or 19, and it must have just completely knocked him out, And yet he doesn't become a Dada artist, if you know what I mean. I mean, the Dada, there's a kind of nihilism, this and that, or that's so how it's said to be, but you feel like he gets a joy and a humor that was already with him, but he kept it going. And then I think collaborating with artists is also about not being an egotist, right? You're working with other people. It's like you're trying to make something that neither of you could do on your own. And I think that says a lot about who he is, and that was, for me, that was inspiring coming to New York and as a young poet and learning about these collaborations, O'Hare working with Norman Bloom, Larry Rivers. I thought, wow, like artists and poets can just hang out and work together. What a wonderful thing. I have to move to New York, Yeah, and you see in the 7-Up, he could have like moved into that kind of pop art logo thing, but he also says art doesn't have to be as big as it is. I mean, there's all these different things he says that you realize they're not offhand. They're really him saying, this is my position and I don't accept this other position.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up his relationship with Dada as well. That was a part of your essay, and that excerpt from Ron talking about it's Ron and Joe and Pat and Ted and their relationship to Dada. And really the way that he took it in, and you talk about this in your part about de Kooning as well, that he's not defacing something. He's not trying to knock something down. He really treats these works and these mimicries, right?
Right.
With like reverence and enthusiasm.
Right.
And Ron talks about the way that they ingested Dada as like a way of life. And because they did that, they were able to move within it. And I think that's so special. And also reading that bit, I mean, that for me and my friends is how we feel about Joe and the New York School and all of those things. So it's really special to hear that take.
It's really the art wasn't a way for them. They didn't think of art as a means to move up in class, right? That was not the way they looked at art. It was their life and they were having fun. I mean, you don't make a notebook of, with Ron and Dick Gallup and Joe and Pat Paget and Ted doing that notebook that ends up in San Diego. I mean, they were just playing. They were having, but it's a kind of play that allows your imagination to go places it might not have gone, and that maybe some way will inform your work, and I think that's what happened. They were into that discovery of what can we do with what we have? Let's see, and I think that playfulness, I mean, in a way, it's one of the characteristics of the New York School that a lot of others people get kind of freaked out about, because you're not supposed to have fun when you're making art or writing. It's supposed to be suffering, or something, or having a revelation that'll save the world. Anyway, Joe didn't go for any of that stuff, and it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, GE is just put in the chat the word glee. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
very important. The most important work to me gets made when everybody's just fucking around.
Yeah.
And if we could go to the next slide, Eleanor. Thank you. So you had a great note during one of our projects that I'd love to hear about the collection of these works. Yeah, go for it.
So the work on the right belongs to Ann Lauterbach, who's a very good friend of Joe's, and she also has a number of other works, including a painting, which I think is the one that she had wanted to put in the book. I hope I'm not quoting you wrong, Ann. Anyway, Ron knew about this work, and he said, "Oh, there's this work by Ann. I really think it should go in." And I was like, "Okay," And then I got someone to photograph the works that she had, and then this came, and I was like, "Whoa, let's put that one in." I mean, Ron was not wrong, and it's like the cowboy who's not the cowboy anymore, right? It's masculinity, but he's saying duck and tide. Right. He's just kind of the whole mask in the same with the one on the left. This masculine image is just kind of deflated, but not, how can I say it? It's like he deflates in a nice way. If that makes sense, or a gentle way. Right. He's not the masculine guy. He's like, "I'm not masculine," and he's gonna like scream about it. Right. He just does it in this kind of offhand way. With this, you can read it as blood coming down this guy's face. What's going on, and why duck? Duck because you're gonna be shot, right? I mean, that occurred to me. I mean, I was looking at it, and then that popped in my head. I went, "Whoa, that's interesting," And then you have to clean yourself off with Tide. Maybe I'm being too literal, but that is a way to read the piece.
I like that read a lot. I think that's good. I wanted to talk a little bit about specifically in this piece, but then also just as a segue to talk about how you did this in the whole book. I mean, I think the way that you collated the work is very conversational. The works, like in places like here, literally look like they're talking to each other, right?
Right.
And then you're pulling strings and threads throughout. And specifically with Joe's work and the work of someone so obsessed with collage and compilation, you say in your essay that he didn't believe that it was accidental, that the beautiful was a deliberate collision and gathering.
Right.
And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about how you went about gathering the work of someone who's so interested in that, because I feel like that's intimidating.
It was intimidating. I can tell you there was times that Ron and I would disagree, or he would say something and I would say something else, but I kind of acceded to him because I felt he knew the work and Joe much better than I did, and I had no axe to grind in terms of how I felt writing about Joe was learning about Joe. It was not beyond the fact that I thought a big book was really important and necessary. I felt like I wanted to learn more about him because I think in a way he is seen as a minor artist, and then you might not like look at it closely. You might not think about it. You might, in that, that way society, affects you, like, "Oh, well, he's okay," but, and I knew that was wrong. I knew there was something there. And I thought, well, if I write a book about, once I was asked, if I write a book about him, I'm going to get to think about him in lots of different ways. So like when I came up with the thing about Ron Johnson and Bruce Conner, two artists that I really admire, I had never had that thought till it was like I was writing the book. And then there was that moment when I was writing and I thought, oh, well, Ron's going to read this and think I'm completely cracked, but I have to go there and see what happens. And then also to kind of separate him from because he is associated with cats and those people, to separate him from those people and find out why he was separate from them. And that was all really useful to my thinking and to my looking at them. I think it's O'Hara who said, I just said this to my students. O'Hara is talking about the second generation of abstract expressionists, Michael Goldberg, Norman Bloom, various, and it's a show that's at the Guggenheim. So, well, it's easy to see the similarity. It's much harder to see the difference. Right. So to really look at an artist, you have to kind of see why they're different from other people. And then finally, not to if you compare them, I'm not comparing Joe's work to Bruce Connor's work. I'm comparing the way they went about dealing with work. Right. And that they have that, because you can't really compare Joe's collages to, Bruce Connor's ink drawing. It would be silly. So that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, and the secession from the art world and Bruce.
Right, they all retreat from the art, or they don't retreat, they pull away from it. They decide the art world is not going to determine how I behave. I'm going to determine how I behave, regardless, and reject the kind of notion that financial success is the measure of who you are, or scale, or things like that.
Yeah, and knowing that, like now hearing you say that that 2019 Tagore show is 2019.
Right. Yeah,
is when you started working on this book, or found out you were going to start working on this book. Makes a lot of sense, because I was just thinking about your article, minor artist or master of the minor, right?
Right.
Which I think just makes so much sense as the starting point for this book. If we could go to the next slide, Eleanor. Thank you. This is one spread of many of book covers, which we all know Joe Brainard did many of. I have one here. This is for Anne. But beautiful part of his practice, mostly for free, big part of the community in that way. And I want to hear you talk about a little bit about those collaborations, and then also, including these in the work. And again, just how to.
That's when I first found out about Joe. It was Ron's book, Great Balls of Fire, the cover, and then the poem that he has for Joe in it, Bingo. And it was like, I don't know, I was either 18 or, well, let's see, it came out in 69. So I was probably 19 or 20. It was not yet in New York. I remember buying the book because I had this, wanted to read what would be called the second generation of the New York school, and just being totally like knocked over by some of the things that Ron did. I mean, there's still one line I sort of remember. It's a poem where he takes the letter out of certain words, like the man steps off the curb becomes the man that steps off the curb. And I remember reading that poem over and over, going, wait a second, this is what he's doing. And then thinking, I got to do that. And then thinking, no, but he's already done that. So you have to figure out something else to do. But it was kind of just magic. It was like seeing all the different things he did in his poems was just like, completely blew me away. And then and then learning more about, there's this guy, Joe Brainard. I should find out about him as well. So that would, kind of moved to New York City. And that's what I did, right? Because you're in Boston. What are you going to look at? You're going to look at color field painting because that's all they would show, and then you're going to bump into Robert Lowell and Harvard Garrett, which is what I did. And I thought, well, I think I have to leave town now and go to that other city just a little further south, And that's not, and I grew up reading Robert Lowell and all those people. And I just suddenly felt like, I want something else out of my poetry.
Yeah, you want to bump into these guys at St. Mark's.
Yeah, exactly. And I did. And that was great.
We've got more book covers on this next slide, Eleanor. Thanks. And this one, Pay Dirt is so good.
Oh yeah.
In the collected, I think, is there a little bit of Pay Dirt in the monograph? I think so, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, just more
And he
collaboration.
doesn't have a style, right? He doesn't, it's so flexible what he's doing. It's like each cover is its own thing, right? There's so many books and so many book designers. You kind of go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. Oh yeah, that's so-and-so, right? And you never feel like that with Joe. You feel like he actually read the work and it's responding to the work. It's not responding to the job, right? Book designing can be like a job, and he's actually interacting with the work, right? You just feel it, you know.
They're so different, they're so diverse, and yeah, they are so attentive to the work, but then you really can feel him in all of them. I think there's something, you'll be looking at a book cover and it's like something's afoot and it's like, oh, it's a Joe cover. That's what it is. That's what's cool. Yeah. And we can go to the next slide. These, I love these flyers. I have a folder in my phone for flyers that Joe made. I think they're so gorgeous and weird and beautiful. Weird. So weird.
Why would you want to make a little island where you probably, be all by yourself, announce a poetry reading? But then it sort of doesn't make sense. It doesn't. That's why I go, okay,
And you have to wonder a little bit, like, was he just on a kick? Was he fucking with them?
I know.
They're so gorgeous, and there's so many of them, which again, you don't get more generous and more proof of generosity than when you look at those.
Right.
Joe. Yeah, we have more flyers on the next slide.
Right. All different. Every one of them's different.
So beautiful.
You can see, say, the theater thing for this Ann Waldman and read by related to the three plays, but then it's totally different at the same time. And it's used differently. It's black and white. You just see how fluid he was in his thinking and doing, right? He didn't get stuck in a way. You never felt like he got stuck, that he had a kind of fluid imagination, right? If you can imagine Nancy as an ashtray, this guy's got a great imagination, right? Just is. And offhand and seemingly casual, but it's, that kind of casual artists would like give up their left hand for, right? They might not say it, but boy, it's the kind of casual that's brilliant, right?
Yeah, what's that Joe says? He says, is it the autobiography? He says, I'd give my right arm to be in love. And he says, nope, my left.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can go to the next slide. I thought this is the most masterful spread, John. I love you putting these all together. I think this portrait of Anne next, like right on top of Jimmy all buttoned up. And then and there's a writing piece by Joe where he describes Bill sitting like this, so grounded. And I just want to talk about, I want you to talk about how you chose this spread and how you put them together.
Well, we tried to get all the drawings, and then I did find there's a bunch in the Mandeville collection. And then there was some issue as to whether they'd send us stuff. Sometimes you write to libraries, they don't send you stuff. But actually the people there were really, really helpful. There was one moment we were like nervous that they wouldn't want to, because it's actually a lot of work to like find all this stuff. So I had to look up where it was in the library and give them the exact number. I tried to do everything to make their job easy. And then I also asked people I asked Jasper Johns if he remembered sitting for Joe. He didn't, but I did ask people. So I just tried to get as much information. And then once you see a bunch of his drawings together, you want to put them together because it's not something he's known for, right? And these drawings are all in a university collection. So I felt like it was really important to show his drawings together, so it's a lot of the choices that I made just seem natural to what the book is telling me should be done. So I'm not that smart. You give me a little more credit. I'm just a facilitator.
Sound like Joe. And we can go to the next slide.
And also you sense the community because these people staff for him, right? That's the other side of the community, right? Okay, I'll take off my clothes and lie in front of you and take a nap and you can draw me, or I'll sit here slightly uptight, Jimmy Schuyler, or I'll just sit here, with my hands on my knees and draw. I mean, if you think of drawing, it's an intimate relationship of some sort with the sitter, right, and the artist, and these people feel comfortable. If you look at a Lucian Freud painting, you can tell these people are bored out of their minds. Like, come on, get the goddamn painting done. I'm sick of listening to you or sitting here. But you don't feel that at all with these people. I mean, she's like asleep. She's like not worried. She's just like, okay, I'm relaxing. And I think that's great. I mean, that's the other side of Joe, is like how people felt at ease around them. And I think that's really pretty amazing. Because there's lots of artists who are never going to feel at ease around, right? They're just going to make us jumpy. We'll twitch like frogs on electricity. So.
Absolutely. I mean, careful. I've got a Lucian Freud book behind my computer. I'll hear you. And then these, I think, I think these are so gorgeous. The eye in the drawing on the right is so beautiful and like weird, and it makes me think about what you're saying about his feelings about his drawing, how he felt so insecure about it, in the ways that these feel unfinished. I mean, I don't even know if I have a specific question around them. They're just gorgeous.
Well, if you think of that drawing that he did when he's at Dayton, that he does on one side of him in the bed, and then he turns it over and does something else. Anyway, when I saw that drawing or that work, I knew it had to go in the book, because then that's when I knew how brilliant he was. I mean, it's just like, there's no hesitation in the line. It's not like he's erasing the line, right? It's just, he does it. It's just there. And then I think what he felt nervous about was the kind of academic notion of you draw a face with volume and this and that, and he wanted to excel at that or be good at it. And actually he is quite good. But I think, there's a kind of standard there. But as an artist who really didn't go to art school, in some sense, he has to set his own standard. And actually, it's pretty interesting that he does that drawing of him in the bed smoking the cigarette, and he already knows he has big feet, right? And or he thinks he has big feet, and it's so beautiful, that drawing. It's so smart and so like sophisticated. I was like floored.
When I was reading your essay for the first time, I took a photo of that that drawing, and I sent it to like everyone I know.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's
what you're doing.
Yeah, it's stunning. And it's like, who was he looking at? What was he thinking about? He just seems to, at that age, you're kind of regurgitating what you're influenced by. You felt like he had totally absorbed it. It was his, and that must have started really early on, just that visual ability to absorb something and make it his.
Yeah. And I want to go to the next slide. This is another, I think this spread is so good. I think it is really funny, especially after talking about his self-image and, how he was like, he thought he had big feet. He thought he was so skinny. He was always wanting to tan. And like to have this self-portrait right next to this, collage of this like gorgeous man, I think is so hilarious.
Oh, and you know the story of someone told them that he really looked good with his shirt unbuttoned.
It was Joe Lasser.
Right. So he always, no matter what weather, I mean, I remember seeing him was quite cold out. He had a white shirt on and a sports jacket, but the white shirt was unbuttoned to like his belly button. And I was like, oh my God, this story I heard about Joe is true, because you hear these stories, you go, yeah. Then suddenly he was walking up, I think, Green Street where he lived, and I'm walking down and I go, oh my God, it's totally true. And it's like 40 degrees out, right? Or whatever. And I was like,
Yeah,
and there he is, right? Unbuttoned. I mean, the minute I saw the painting, I was reminded of that story of Joe.
and I mean, the man's handsome as hell. Like,
Yes.
I was reading that piece last night, actually. He says some time ago, Joe Lasser made the mistake of telling me I have a terrific stomach.
Right.
And then we can go.
And also as a self-portrait, like most self-portraits, you think of Lee Krasner, Clifford Still, they're very serious by the easel, right? And he's serious, but he's not taking himself too seriously. Like, how do you do that, right? And it's pretty great, right? And he doesn't even show his full face. Self-portrait, you're supposed to show your face, right? He's got the top of his head cut off.
No,
You're doing it wrong,
Totally. And I mean, like, I talk about this a lot with him. He was very serious in his humor. He was serious in his care, he was serious in his generosity, but he didn't take himself too seriously.
Right.
Which is so special. And we can go to the next slide, Eleanor.
I love this one.
I love these. I love all of Joe's flowers. These specifically are so good to me. And it's funny, they're Lucky Strikes. We know he smoked terracins, or I'm never saying that right. But I love these
flowers in a Lucky Strike package. I mean, then again, it's just kind of surprise, right?
Exactly. And I think also it just makes me think all the time about how much he cared about beautiful things. And he in Ted Berrigan and Anne Waldman's Memorial Day, Ted says that he asked Joe Brainard what he thought about death, and Joe said, well, you get lots of flowers when you die. Which I think is so good. But yeah, with these and with the next slide, when we get to it, I wanted to ask about how you included the things that are more well known, that people have seen before but feel really important, and what selections you made there.
I just tried to pick the best ones I could find out of all of them, and ones that were slightly odd, like the flowers out of the Lucky Strike thing. But also I wanted to write about the fact that they're pansies, that this is a negative term for queers, and that then he does each one. He does each one, and then he puts it on the thing. It's the opposite of Warhol, yet it's multiple images of multiple works, and there's a kind of deep care in this, and at the same time, it's almost like he's still in the second grade in terms of his school materials, right? But it's sort of like the most sophisticated second grader you're ever going to bump into. Oh, he's like the second grader that probably make you want to quit school, never go back to school, right? Oop, this guy is too much. And I just love that side. And he's like, it seems so casual, but this piece is not casual at all, right? And then the scale is 8 by 6 inches, but it's really, Pollock all over painting. He's got all that in his head. And yet, if it had been like 8 feet by 6 feet in an oil painting, would we have seen it differently? And as he says, does it need to be that big? And I would have to go along with Joe and say, no, you just make your point in this 8 by 6 inch piece. Right. And it's great. And it's like pushes back against Pollock's all over paintings.
Yeah, it's so gorgeous. And also, I mean, thinking about their reproduction in the book, it makes it so well suited to be shown in this way. And
Right.
also I was on this whole rip about how the scale of his work makes so much sense for, like literally passing it to his friends and, people putting in their pockets and
Right.
and it was very much tied to that generosity, which I think is so lovely.
Right.
We can go to the Nancy's next, Eleanor. Yeah. I mean, what is there to say?
Oh, really? You kind of wish he did more of them. I mean, that's the one, because you wonder where he had gone. I love the one if Nancy was an ashtray. I have to say, it's so wild and so like provocative and sexual, right? And just all these different things, but just sort of like asked as an innocent child's question, right? I mean, how did he brings all that together in one little thing. It's like so smart.
Have you seen that? There was like a letter that I think I saw it from Siglio. I think they got sent to Siglio. It was like a letter that someone had sent them, like a hate mail letter, basically, because they had bought the Nancy book for their like niece or something who really liked the Nancy comics. And they bought this book and then they looked through it with their niece or whoever. They like sent this letter and they were like, this is a dirty, nasty book. And it's like, this letter is like the best response to the Nancy's that has ever been written. We should publish it, put it in a book.
Should.
Yeah, so good. And then we'll get to questions in just a second, but before we do, the Whipper.
Oh, this is great, right? I mean, it's the painting of the dog Whipper. I remember, I think it was Dara Park, the painter, had one of these paintings, I believe, in his house at some point. And that's where I first saw Joe's painting of the dog. And I was like, I remember saying Dara, like we were just like exclaiming what a wonderful painter he was. And Dara himself was a painter. And that I don't that's my memory. It could be wrong, but I know that I saw one of the dog paintings, in somebody's house, and just being knocked out. Because I didn't know about these paintings, and then seeing them and just realizing what a good painter. And he picks the perfect subject that's not going to move, right? Not going to get bored, not going to move. Paint the dog, right? Which dawned on me, it's like, of course, he doesn't want to bore somebody. He doesn't want to make them go through anything. The dog's not going to move. The dog's going to stay in the same position for hours, and then he gets to paint it. It's so smart.
And it's just a practice. It's so full of care, and you can
right. Oh, it's totally full of care.
And it just makes me think of Kenward, and
Yeah. And it's their relationship, right? And it's an honor, and then memorializes it.
So gorgeous. Well, yeah, I thank you, John, again. I think we're gonna open up to questions now and hear from the folks in the chat.
Thank you so much, Tyhe and John. This has been so special and just such an absolute joy. So thank you so much to both of you. We do have a few questions from the audience, and if anyone else wants to chime in with another question, please feel free to raise your hand or write it in the chat. So our first question will be from our friend GE.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Tyhe, wonderful. John, thank you. League of Brainard. Question is, as the enduring power of Joe Brainard's poetry and his like everything else, and it is everything else, is it that it reminds us that there's no ultimate ideas, but that there's like multiple ways of generating them?
I guess so. I can't answer questions like that. They seem too above my head. Enduring. I just think he's a wonderful artist. Like, that's my 2 cents. and a wonderful writer. And he sort of defeats the notion that an artist has to be a miserable human being. I think that alone is like a wonderful thing to know about him. So, and he's just inventive. He's just really inventive and in touch with himself in a way that a lot of people aren't. So that's all I have to say. I know it's probably not that smart, but
No, that says it. Thanks, man. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, John. Thanks, GE. We have another question from Nancy, and Chloe will be asking on Nancy's behalf.
Hi, Tyhe and John. Nancy's question is, I'm always interested in the close relationship between poets and visual artists and their work and arts community. Could you expand on that and on those relationships?
well, I think with Joe, he had a special relationship. He and Ron had a special relationship, and he and Ted and Dick Gallup, all meeting in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think, poetry is seen as one thing and art is seen as another. There's a kind of hierarchy of thinking. And I think Joe never got involved in that hierarchy. And I think that's important, right? That it was all magic and it was all art. It was not about A costs more money, therefore it's worth more important, or blah, blah, blah. And I think they had a real kind of support system. And I think in a way that's important. And I don't know of lots of relationships like that. I think the one with Joe and Ron and Ted and Dick is really special. And I think it's something we can learn from, actually.
In what way?
Well, that you can have a kind of community, it's like, say, Robert Duncan and Jess. There's other, that there's certain communities where poets and artists are treated with a kind of equal respect. That it has nothing to do with what society thinks or mainstream society. Like whenever MoMA has a poetry reading series, you feel like they're just bringing in poets so they can prove that they care about poetry, but they don't really care about poetry. It's just MoMA or any other museum, just, kind of acting like they're really with it. And meanwhile, the New York Times says, oh, nobody reads poetry anymore because nobody reads the poetry that they're promoting anymore. Give me a break. Yeah, Gertrude Stein, you can think of different groups where a lot of stuff is generated, but with Joe and that group, you didn't feel like anybody was the center of attention, that the attention shifted around in that group. And I think that was really, Kenward, all of those people, that it was different. I might be idealizing it, but I'm young still. I can idealize.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that question. We have another question from Lynn Crawford. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, this is wonderful. I just was curious if you were going to talk about I Remember, his book, I Remember.
We can talk about it, but I think when I wrote the book, I deliberately wanted to separate the art from the writing, because the writing in some ways better known, at least among writers. But it's more books that have been sold than anything else of shows, and I didn't want to. So I didn't quote anything from the book. I really just didn't want to I wanted to call attention to how particular he was as an artist, because I feel like sometimes the comparison, because of the nature of the kind of autobiographical side of I remember that people tend to like, oh, I can identify with that, or all those silly reasons why people like certain kinds of writing that I don't even see how great it is. Pardon my grumpiness. So that's why I didn't have anything to do. I didn't want to have it confused. There was one moment I thought of including some of his writing at the back of the book, and then I just thought better, like they can go out and buy the book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Lynn. We have our final question from Charlie. And if anybody does want to ask one more question, now is your chance. So please let us know. And for now, pass it to Charlie.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks, John. Really amazing conversation. Earlier, you were talking about the apartment where Ted and John stayed. It seemed like a really special place. And I was curious if there were other places, apartments, studios, St. Mark's comes to mind, but other places in Joe's life, that were significant to his life, to his work, to his writing.
Oh yeah, there's the apartment he shared with Tony Toll that I think Tony Toll got from Frank, where there's a room that seems like it had no window. It had just an opening onto the kind of major room. And then Tony had his own bedroom. And he lived in that room, made art in that room. And according to Tony, it was so small that when people came over to look at the art, he had to stand the bed up and lean it against the wall so he could put stuff on the wall. So there's that apartment. And then the other apartment is, I can't remember exactly where it was, that he and Ron lived in or shared. So it's like a walk up. It's like a fifth floor walk up, and it has no electricity. He never turns it on. They eat by candlelight. And they eat like, I don't know, I forget, Ron described their dinners. It was pretty intense, like a hamburger, a Diet Coke or a Coca-Cola, and like a cookie. You felt like they were back in Tulsa, Oklahoma, going to the cafeteria, high school cafeteria. Anyway, there's, that was their life, and they didn't see, they lived it, but they didn't, you don't hear about it in some way. You know what I mean? What you get is that they did a lot of work, during that time. And then the apartment, it's a storefront that he shares with Ted. Is like and according to Ron, when Ron said that when they went to Dayton, Ohio to get Joe his first apartment, he basically took the first apartment he saw. That he was not interested in, like, it had to have certain things. It's like, can I move in? Is it reasonably comfortable, and can I work there? That seemed to me what I got out of that. That he wasn't looking for anything fancy or particular, right? Does it have a marble counter? None of that. Does it have, the right kind of refrigerator? And if you look at the picture of his loft that, on Green Street, there's nothing fancy about it. It's basically a bed and a table and a chair. I mean, and a lot of stuff on the floor. So yeah, I mean, I think he really lived the work in some way, and he loved lots of other things, but that working was like a big part of his life. Making, let's put it that way, not working, making, two different things. And reading. I mean, this is a guy who also read all, I don't want to know how, he probably read all of Dostoevsky twice or three times. So, there I was, living in my apartment thinking, I have only read about 5 novels by Charles Dickens, and I don't know anything. And this guy's reading it for the second time. Help.
Oh, thank you so much, Charlie. That was a really great question. And thank you again, John. again, just this has been such a special. Oh, I think we might have one last question from Annie. So this can be the final one. Annie, if you would like to unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
I came in late. I'm sorry. I feel like I landed right in the middle of art, and the flow and comfortability of both yourself, John, and Ty, and with Joe's work has been just a really beautiful experience. And the points, John Yau, that you make about what we do to bring art and how we are with our art is so important. So thank you for your time and thank you for your thoughts.
Sure. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was a really sweet note to end on. We do have a
There's Ron in a hat.
sorry. Yes, hi Ron. Do you want to say anything?
Love that hat, Ron.
Better now or better now? Better now. Hello. Thank you, John and Ty and Eleanor and everybody else. It was really wonderful. Really wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks, Ron. Great to see you. And we do have a tradition here at the Rail of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And as John and Ty are both poets, they will be reading work by Joe Brainard or on Joe Brainard. So
I'm gonna read the first poem that where I heard the word Joe Brainard. And it's a poem by Ron called Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. But now that he's in the audience, I'm gonna become a nervous wreck. So put the hat over there. Thank you, Ron. Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. I could have made that line into a whole stanza. I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. Or I could change the line arrangement. I suffer when I sit. That sounds like hemorrhoids. I don't know anything about hemorrhoids, such as if it hurts to sit when you have them. If so, I must not have them because it doesn't hurt me to sit. I probably sit about 8/15 of my life. Also, I don't suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard. Actually, I don't even suffer when I sit next to his painting Bingo, or for that matter, any of his paintings. In fact, I didn't originally say I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. My wife said it in response to something I had said about another painting of his. She had misunderstood what I had said. I mean, if you grew up reading Robert Lowell and you read a poem like that, it's like you have to completely reorient your head. So that was what happened when I started reading certain poets, including Ron. So thanks for reorienting my head, Ron.
Thank you, John, for that. I have also been reoriented in the head by Joe and Ron and everyone. I'm reading I was pulling all my books and making sure that I'm still reading this piece, but John said I should, so I'm doing that one. I've been, moving back and forth. It's hard to choose with Joe. Can't believe you made a book, John. I'm reading Worrywart, which is in this first
Broadway.
Of Broadway. I got Broadway 2 at Unnameable a little while ago for a bit of a steal, thanks to my friend Eli, and I found this one at the sale of Kenward's work that Better Read Than Dead did, which is really cool because it has all my favorites in it, Ron included, actually. Hi. This is Worrywart, once I find it. Worrywart. Let me tell you about my mother and car doors. Well, with my mother in the car, now are you sure the door is locked? It didn't really matter if the door was locked or not, because you couldn't lean up against it anyway, even if it was locked, because you never know. A total lack of faith in car door locks is what it would seem to amount to, except that, believe me, it didn't stop with car door locks. My mother, she had a real nose for danger in many other areas of life's activities as well, such as petting stray dogs, getting pneumonia from catching a cold from wet hair, drafts and bare feet, or falling down from standing up in the bathtub and bashing your head open, etc. All of which is by no means meant to knock my mother. Sweet as a button, wouldn't hurt a fly, etc. And you can hardly blame a person for being how they are. And besides, the way I see it is that by the time you're 36 years old, you can only blame yourself for any kinks you've yet to iron out in yourself. I still have an instinctive fear of balls, especially when they are coming right at you at a rapid rate, due in part, I'm sure, to this very vivid vision I seem to have of ball making contact to face, the gory details of which I'll kindly spare you, except for, I can't resist, slivers of glass flying into your eyeballs from out of smashed spectacle frames, dangling from what used to be a nose. But like I said, I don't blame nobody for nothing, not even myself very much, if the truth be known. And so, in an optimistic vein, I still have ball to look forward to someday, should my interest ever happen to warrant the effort, which is hard to imagine, however, at this stage in the game. At any rate, to get back to car door locks, let me assure you that I now absolutely enjoy leaning up against unlocked car doors immensely. Gee. And thank you again so much, John. I'm really so grateful
Thank
to
you.
have this conversation today. And thank you all for coming. I'm
Thank you.
a fan of you all and Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those readings, John and Tyhe. That was so perfect. Such an amazing way to end a really, really special afternoon. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring the NSE program and for supporting our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Matt Mulliken and Dan Cameron on the event of Matt Mulliken's Sunday, August 9, 1908 at Peter Freeman Inc. We will conclude tomorrow with a reading by Patrick Hill. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for being here today, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
Thank
amazing.
you, John.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Ty.
Thanks,
you.
John.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Ty.
you.
Thank you.
Congratulations, John and
Thank
Tyhe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Ty.
Great, great.
Bye, everybody.
Congratulations on the book.